Ja, welcome to another video lecture on our YouTube channel, Das andere Mittelalter. My name is Johannes Preiser-Capella. I'm working at the Institute for Medieval Research at the Division for Byzantine Research of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And I'm dealing especially also with aspects of global history and the connection between the Byzantine Empire and the wider medieval world. And within this framework, today I would like to talk a little bit about aspects of the connections between Byzantium and Northern Europe between the 9th and 12th century, but up to the 14th century, under the title of Vikings at the Bosporus. So we will try to connect. The medieval Roman Empire, which only in later scholarship was called the Byzantine one. So the so-called Byzantines themselves regarded themselves as Romei in Greek, so as Romans, as unbroken continuation of the Roman Empire. And this medieval Roman Empire was one of the most important polities in the Mediterranean and in Europe, located in the Eastern Mediterranean with the center in Constantinople. And we will look at the connections between this polity and from the perspective of the Mediterranean to the northern European periphery, so the homelands of the so-called Vikings. There's of course a long debate why from the late 8th century onwards we have this rapid expansion of Viking groups all over northern Europe and other parts of Europe and the Mediterranean. This has been connected to theories about overpopulation, which then exerted migration pressure, or it has been connected to climate change. So we know that in the turn from the 8th to 9th century, we have the beginning of the so-called medieval climate anomaly or medieval warm period at least in Northern and Western Europe. And this may have had an impact for the opportunities of the Vikings, for instance, to settle in Iceland or in Greenland, but per se on its own alone is not a unique explanation why there was this expansion of the Vikings in this period. What is quite clear is that the Viking expansion from the late 8th century onwards depended on earlier developments. So already since the 7th century, there was an intensification of trade networks in the North Sea and in the Baltic Sea between centers like Kaupang, Pirka, Hedeby, Dorestad. And at the same time, we also have technical developments with regard to seafaring. So we have new types of ships, like the famous longships, but also the Knorr, which was mainly also a merchant vessel. So we have the emergence of the necessary infrastructure in terms of seafaring technology, but also knowledge about sea routes and also knowledge about resources or territories, which could be interesting, so to say, for military advances. So this infrastructure for the Viking expansion is emerging in the centuries before, and we can only understand this on the basis of these earlier developments. As for the causes of the Viking expansion, there's also a long controversy about the naming of these people, the etymologies, also where the stories of origin, both for the Western sources and also for Eastern Greek and Arabic and Slavic sources. So in the West, of course, we have the famous term Viking, which can be interpreted as someone who goes on a long sea or robbery trip on a Vik, although then the etymology of Vik is unclear or also contested. Then we also have in the Latin sources the term Nordmanni, so the man from the north. Then less specific Pagani or Pirate, indicating that these people were pagans, non-Christians, and that they invaded Christian territories as pirates. Then we have Pars pro toto, Dani, so the Danes as one prominent group, then applying this term to all of these people. And then, for instance, in Irish chronicles, we also have specific terms like Fingale and Dubgale, so white strangers, black strangers for various groups, especially Norwegians and Danes, which were especially prominent in Irish territories. In the Eastern sources, in the Greek sources, or also in the Arabic sources, we have these terms Varangian, so Varangi, or in Arabic Varang, and the various theories. One is that Varangi, so a group of people, companions who are united by a pledge, and on this basis then make an expedition. But there were also attempts to connect this to a Western Slavic tribe named Varangians in other sources. So the Varangians is a prominent term, and then there is also this term the Rus or the Ros, also in Greek sources then, from where also the term Russia or the Russian countries emerges. And the etymology of this term was also very much contested, especially in the 19th century, also in connection with nationalism and also all these weird theories about Germanic race and Slavic race, which all led then up to the tragic events of Nazism and World War II. And so we have here various theories which try to connect this term to either Scandinavian origins or Slavonic origins, even to Iranian origins, to tribes of the Alans, ethnic group which can be located originally to the northwest of the Caucasus. So all this is contested. We can only say that these terms emerge in the sources and then are applied to these groups coming from Scandinavia all the way to the Mediterranean. So what is clear that we have a huge geographical scope. So the Viking expansion really including not only Northern Europe, but also Western Europe, areas of the Mediterranean, Eastern Europe, and all the way to the North Atlantic, Iceland, Greenland, even to North America. And this is famously discussed, and of course much more prominent often are the aspects of the expansion towards the West. This also includes, of course, the rich history of the Viking presence on the British Isles, starting with the famous plundering of the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793, which then was followed up by further invasions, then the permanent establishment of Viking polities like the princedom or kingdom of York, but also then we have Viking kingdoms in Ireland and in northern Scotland on the Orkney Islands, and then even we have the full integration of England into a Scandinavian empire of Knut in the 11th century. So all this is well discussed and also well known. The Vikings then also attacked the territories of the Frankish Empire after the death of Charlemagne in 814, especially then when this Frankish Empire disintegrated under the grandsons of Charlemagne. Then this also led then to the permanent establishment of northern or Norman princedoms, in this case in the Normandy. You have here a picture of the baptism of the Duke of Normandy, Rollo, who then became Christian and therefore was then also integrated into the nobility of the Western Frankish kingdom. So also this is a well-known aspect, and this then of course later also connected to the Norman conquest of England after the Battle of Hastings. In this time, we also have changes in Scandinavia itself. So we see the emergence of various indigenous kingdoms, first in Denmark, later also the core of the Swedish kingdom, various kingdoms in Norway. And this establishment and also then strengthening of indigenous kingship is also connected with Christianity. So also not only the faces is imported, but also then techniques and legitimation of power. You see this, for instance, this is the famous runestone from Jelling in Denmark, where you already have a depiction of the crucified Jesus Christ in the Scandinavian tradition, for instance. At the same time, we see that other groups are also moving away from Scandinavia towards the northern Atlantic, over the far areas, then to Iceland already in the 9th century, and in the 10th century even to Greenland, where 2 settlements are established, and then even all the way to North America. This was very much discussed until in the 1960s. There was firm archaeological evidence in the form of the Viking settlement of Nancy-on-Meadows on Newfoundland, where it's now clear that there was for some time a Viking settlement, which also confirms what is described in the various sagas, which indicate the discovery of seafaring expeditions of Leif Erikson and other groups. Interestingly, we also have now further evidence of the integration of the settlements on Greenland into the wider trade networks of Europe. And one important export article was walrus ivory, so the teeth of walruses, which were used in the same way like ivory from elephants. And this recent study on the basis of isotope analysis was able to really trace back the origin of objects which were produced from this walrus ivory to specific regions on Greenland. So we really see now how this walrus ivory from Greenland via Iceland and Scandinavia was traded across Europe, all the way also to Byzantium. To the right, you see, for instance, one object created in the 11th, 12th century from walrus ivory, and now to be found in the Landesmuseum in Mainz. The Vikings also made their way to the Mediterranean. We have already in the 9th century plunderings of settlements in the Iberian Peninsula, then under Arab rule. And then also all the way to Italy, which then finally also led to the emergence of a Norman polity in southern Italy in the 11th century, which then became also a competitor of the Byzantine Empire. We will not focus today so much on this aspect. This would be a different talk. We will mention the Normans later on, but this is of course also an aspect of this Viking expansion which affected Byzantium. The main route from Scandinavia to Constantinople led via Eastern Europe, via the river systems. And already in the 8th century, we see the emergence of settlements, also connecting to this general intensification of trade in the Baltic Sea and the North Sea, which we have mentioned already. And one of the earliest ones is at Lake Ladoga, now in northern Russia. And the settlement of Stara Ladoga, which can be traced back to the mid-8th century, and which then became a stepping point for further expansion and further expeditions of these groups all the way south to Constantinople. We have then the first reference to Vikings or Varangians or Scandinavians making all the way to Constantinople in a Western source. And this is an interesting episode. In 839, a delegation from the Byzantine Emperor Theophilos was sent to the Frankish Emperor Louis the Pious, and he received this delegation in his palace in Ingelheim at the Rhine, now in Germany. And you see here reconstruction. And these Byzantine delegates were accompanied by people from the north, who are called Ros, as we hear here, and their king, Chagan by name, had sent them originally to Constantinople. But then, since their way had led them through barbaric and terribly white peoples, the Byzantine emperor, who had now an interest into these people, didn't want them to send them back via the same route, fearing that they would kill there, and so would be killed there, and so he sent them to the Frankish Empire, and from there they should make their way onwards to Scandinavia. However, via these negotiations, the Frankish emperor found out that these people were actually called Ros, were actually Swedish, so Vikings, the same people who were at that time already plundering the coasts of his empire, and therefore they kept them with him until it could be truthfully established whether they had come with honest intentions or not. So also one could say the Ros ended up also here in a say delicate situation. Interestingly, we have here the reference to the name of the ruler, which is called Chagan. And this is not a personal name, but this is the title of the Khan, the Kagan, which was used by the steppe people already for centuries now, and especially was also used by the Khazars, a Turkish-speaking people or group which had established an empire to the north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea in the mid-7th century, and was still controlling these routes in Eastern Europe at that period. And obviously in imitation of this supreme ruler of this region, also the Ros had started to name their own leader Khan, imitating, one could say, the Khazar tradition. We have also later in the Byzantine text called De Administrando Imperio, so written by Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus in the mid-10th century. There's a description in this text on the actual route from the Varangians to the Greeks. leading via the Eastern European riverine system. So from the Baltic Sea via Eastern Europe to the Black Sea. And we also hear in this description that there were passages in between where the Varangians had to carry their ships overland because there was not a continuous river connection. And of course, these were also areas where there was danger. Actually, as we also hear in this earlier description, we hear, for instance, later that the Pechenegs, another steppe group, which was originally also under the supreme control of the Khazars, was attacking Varangians who at these very dangerous passages throughout the way. But this route became even more intensively used throughout the 9th and then 10th century. There were other routes leading further to the east, to via the Dnieper, and then also especially via the Volga to the Caspian Sea and all the way to Central Asia, to the Islamic world, to the Iranic, to the Iranian areas. And we have a very early artifact of these long-distance connections in this Buddha statue found in Helgö in Sweden, found in a layer which can be dated to the 8th century. This Buddha statue as such is even older. It was produced in the 6th century CE in Gandhara, in the northern Indian Pakistan region, which was a center of Buddhism at that time. And we don't know the exact route, maybe via various stations in between, made it all the way to the Baltic Sea to Sweden already in the 8th century. And also these routes became more intensively used throughout the centuries. As I've mentioned before, since the mid-7th century, these territories were under the control of the Khazars, who had the center of the power near the delta of the Volga, their capital of Itil, which is not located until now. And interestingly, these Khazars selected to follow a third way between Christianity, which would have been the Byzantine option, and Islam, so the Caliphate option. They decided, most probably around 800, to convert to Judaism. And we also have the later Hebrew correspondence about this fact. The dating was for a very long time contested also in scholarship. I've talked about this aspect elsewhere. Maybe I will also make a talk for our channel. The debate as such is now to a certain extent has come to a solution due to archaeological findings. In 1999, there was found a coin hoard on the island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea, which is now part of Sweden. And this coin hoard included Khazar dirhams, so silver coins, which were created by the Khazars in imitation of Arabic silver coins. And on the silver coins, there was not the usual inscription that Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, is the messenger of God, but that Moses is the messenger of God, which indicates already that the Khazars at that time have converted to Judaism. And this coin hoard can be very exactly be dated to the year 837, 838. So this is a terminus antiquem. Before that time, the Khazars must have converted to Judaism. This coin hoard is only one among many, as you can see on the map. And this comes from this project of Marek Jankowiak at Oxford University about a dirham for slaves. And there's also a forthcoming important publication. And there's really a flow of silver coins. So there are thousands of such silver coins to be found from the 9th, 10th century across Eastern and Northern Europe. And these must represent actual millions of coins which have been sent to these territories. Some of them also were melted, turned into other forms. So this is only the ones which can be traced now in the archaeological evidence. We know from the sources what the Northmen were trading towards the Islamic world, so which at that time Byzantium and the Islamic world were without doubt the richest regions in Western Eurasia. And what did the Northmen bring there? They were trading with furs, with metal, with amber, with honey and wax, and most prominently or most expensively slaves, which made the high prices, especially also special slaves, then either warrior slaves like Mamluks, or also slaves who were turned into eunuchs, castrated, and there were special castration centers, both in Western Europe but also in Central Asia, for the slave trade towards the centers of the Islamic world. But the Vikings or the Varangians also made it into these territories for plundering, for military invasions. already in 865. We hear of the first invasion of the Rus into the Caspian Sea, and these first forays of the Rus into the Caspian Sea until the mid-10th century were made based on agreements with the Khazars, because the Khazars were controlling the main route via the Volga, so the Khazars had to let them through, and there was obviously also a division of the booty, of the plunder. And we see that they made such attacks along the coasts of the Caspian Sea, also forays into the interior of what is today Azerbaijan and northern Iran. And the last of these spectacular expeditions can be dated to 1041-42, and it was under the leadership of a Swedish Viking called Ingvar Wittfarne. Wittfarne is the one who has traveled far in Scandinavian language. And for Vikings who were participating in this campaign, there was found a cluster of gravestone, of runestones in the area around Stockholm. So you will see this on this map. So this was obviously the main area of origin where this man came from, who made this far-reaching expedition all the way to what is now northern Iran. This Varangian connection to Central Asia and to the Islamic world was also connected to geopolitical changes at the time within the Islamic world. So in the late 9th century, there's the emergence of quasi-independent princedoms who only nominally are still under the sovereignty of the Caliph in Baghdad. And one of the most prominent one was the dynasty of the Samanids in Central Asia, in Bukhara and Samarkand, who were also minting an enormous amount of silver coins, who were among the most important sources of these coin hoards we have discussed. And the Samanids came into contact also with a group which originally was under the control of the Khazars, which are the Bulgars. So they are the Bulgars, the Bulgarians, of course, at the Danube. But there was also a part of the Bulgars who had migrated in the 7th century to the east, to the Volga, and established a polity there, which came under Khazar control. But then in the early 10th century, these Bulgars at the Volga tried to become independent, and in order to support this claim of independence, they also converted to Islam against the Judaism option of their former overlords of the Khazars. And in this context, they also sent an embassy to the Caliph, and the Caliph sent also an ambassador back to strengthen this connection to these newly converts to Islam. And this delegation from Baghdad in the 920s was led by Ibn Fadlan, who also wrote a description about this journey and also how he met a group of Varangians at the Volga River. And if we read this description, this is more or less the script for first half of hour, one could say, of the movie with Antonio Banderas, The 13th Warrior, if you have seen it. This is based, say, in the first half an hour, then it later becomes a fantasy movie, is based on the description of Ibn Fadlan. Based on these trade routes, eventually also in Eastern Europe we have the emergence of polities, of princedoms, which have a Scandinavian element. As I've said, this was very much contested also in Russian and other scholarship in the 19th century. In the much later written down Nestor Chronicle from the 12th century, so 300 years or 400 years after the events, we have this description how this actually came about. So that here we read that the Slavic tribes in the area first of Novgorod in the north and then of Kiev in what is now Ukraine, more or less invited groups of Scandinavians, most prominently under the dynasty of Rurik and his descendant Oleg, which then became the ancestors of the Rurikids, which were ruling all over Russia until the 16th century, one could say, until then the Romanovs take over in Muscovy. And that this is the emergence of the Russian state, of the state of the Rus in Eastern Europe. As I've said, this is very much contested. I only show here the text. What we can establish is that in the 860s and then in the 880s, we have the emergence of this Rus principality in Novgorod and then in Kiev, which then also came into contact with Byzantium. This contact was, as we already have seen, based also on diplomacy and trade, but also in this case, the Rus tried really to attack Constantinople. We may assume that they were not expecting really to conquer the city. Maybe it was also to exert some political pressure to have the opportunity to establish treaties with Byzantium, to have a permanent basis for trade with this great market of Constantinople. And this was achieved after this first attacks. We have then in 907 the first treaty, followed by further treaties throughout the 10th and 11th century. And this allowed the Rus to have a permanent presence, but they were not allowed to have their quarters directly in Constantinople. So we see here on the map, you have the Golden Horn and the peninsula where Constantinople is located, and to the north, in the Bosporus, on the European side, there was a place called Hagios Mamas. And in Hagios Mamas, the Varangians had the opportunity to establish their quarters. And from there, they were allowed during the day, only in small groups, up to 40 men or so, to really visit actual Constantinople to make their business there, and then they had to get back. So of course, also due to the early attacks, the Byzantines were a little bit suspicious of these newcomers from the north, so they tried to exert control of their coming and going, so that there would not emerge a further invasion of the city, for instance. But on this basis then, and this is also true for a lot of other groups coming to the labor market of Byzantium, which was especially a military labor market, these groups then were also hired as mercenaries for the Byzantine army. And these Varangians, as they were called, became very famous as Belikophori in Greek. This means the axe-bearings. So they became notorious, one could say also, for the big war axes they were carrying, which became their signature weapon, also in Byzantine depictions. To the left, you have a depiction of the imperial palace, and you have the Varangians, the Varangian Guard. We will talk about the emergence of this guard later, carrying their axes as their signature. And we have then lists of troops employed for 3 attempts to reconquer Crete. The island of Crete in the southern Aegean had been conquered by Arabs in the 820s, and they were a permanent threat for the core maritime connection of Byzantium. So there were various attempts to reconquer the island. And in 902, 911, and 949, also Varangians, several hundreds of them, were paid to fight for Byzantium. We hear also about the amount of gold they are receiving. So this was also a profitable business for these men who were coming from northern Europe, also from the Rus region, to make a fortune, one could say. Of course, this would have been augmented by plunder. In this case, the 3 expeditions were failures. Only in the 960s then Byzantium was able to reconquer Crete, but this employment of the Varangians already from the early 10th century onwards is a very interesting indication of the growing importance also of these groups for the Byzantine armed forces. Of course, then the Byzantines, as in the case of other neighbors, also tried to establish a religious connection, to convert these newcomers to their interpretation of Christianity, so Orthodox Christianity. And this was successful with one member of the ruling house of the Rus, which is Princess Olga. She, in 955, traveled to Constantinople, and here we have a depiction from a later Russian chronicle where she is meeting the emperor, and she even received baptism, so she became a Byzantine Christian. But, and this is also similar to other groups, at the same time she also got into negotiations with the Western counterpart to Byzantium, the German king and later Emperor Otto I. So there was always also the idea to counterbalance Byzantine influence with connections to the West. And later on, we also have princesses from Kiev marrying kings and princes of Hungary, of Germany, of France. So Kiev became an important part of this diplomatic network across Christian Europe, not only in the connection to Byzantium. The baptism of Olga was not yet a sign of permanent Christianization. Her successor Svatoslav was still a pagan. He was a very successful war leader. He was then able to destroy the competing Khazar Empire. In the 960s, he plundered and conquered the Khazar fortresses of Sarkel and then later even the capital of Itil. So this is more or less the end of the Khazar Empire. And then later he was also invited by the Byzantine emperors to invade Bulgaria. Bulgaria was a continuous competitor with Byzantium on the Balkans since the late 7th century. And Svatoslav was very successful. He really conquered core areas of Bulgaria. But then he decided that he would stay there, that he would also establish his own empire next to Byzantium. And this was not as Constantinople has planned. So what followed was then an actual confrontation, a war between Svatoslav and the Byzantine Emperor John I Tzimiskes, which eventually ended with a Byzantine victory, and Svatoslav had to retreat to his territories. And this is to the right, you see this is of course a fictitious depiction of this encounter of Svatoslav, who is depicted in a very barbarian way, one could say, and the Byzantine emperor. Svatoslav then later was killed on his way back to Kiev by Pechenek groups in the southern Ukraine. But then under his successor Vladimir, eventually we have then the Christianization of the Rus. We have this description in the later Laurentius Chronicle, so that Vladimir was sending envoys to all neighboring countries to learn about the religions. And it was the envoys from Constantinople which were the most enthusiastic. So they describe here when they entered then Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral in Constantinople. And we don't know if we were in heaven or on earth. There is no such sight and beauty on earth, and we are unable to tell it. We only know that God is there with his people, and their worship is better than that of all countries, because we cannot forget this beauty. And of course, on this basis, then Vladimir decides to become a Byzantine Christian. The historical truth is a little bit less, one could say romantic, although it includes a marriage, a wedding. So in the 980s, the then emperor in Constantinople, Basil II, had to fight against various generals who tried to overthrow him. And one of the most dangerous ones was Spartas Phokas, who was a member of a family from which in earlier times an emperor had already ruled in Constantinople, Nikephoros Phokas. And Badas Phokas had been able really to unite most of the troops from Asia Minor. So it was really a dangerous situation for Basil II. And in this situation, he received help from Kiev. A core of, as we read here, a select and large group of Scythians from the Tauros. So the Byzantine sources often use ancient terms. Here the Scythians, originally steppe people, which we encounter already in Herodotus in the 5th century BCE. And Tauros is a ancient Greek term for the Crimea. So this Greek group came to Constantinople in friendship and was then integrated into the army, and they successfully attacked the army of the rebel general Badas Phokas and defeated it. And this was then the basis for the eventual victory of Basil II. And this is also the real origin of the Varangian Guard. So the survivors of this group were then permanently integrated into the Byzantine army and were then the core of what became the Varangian Guard, which existed over the next more than 300 years, as we will see. Another effect of these help coming from Kiev was that Vladimir, the Prince of Kiev, of course, also had his own interests. And so in order to also increase his legitimation, he received the hand of the sister of Basil II, of a Byzantine princess, Anna, which was a very rare event at this time. So almost no outsider was allowed to marry a Byzantine princess, especially not a direct relative of the emperor. Even Emperor Otto I, for his son Otto II, only, in inverted commas, had received a niece of the emperor, but not really a sister or a daughter. This time, since this help was so important, Vladimir of Kiev received Anna, the hand of Anna, but a precondition for this in turn was that he was baptized, and this took place in the city of Kherson on the Crimea, and we have here the picture and also a description in the later Russian chronicle. And this was then really the start of the actual Christianization of the land of the Rus under Byzantine influence. We also have in the description that then Vladimir then forced, one could say, also the population of Kiev to get baptized, and that also places of earlier pagan veneration of idols were destroyed and churches were established. Most famously, of course, then the Hagia Sophia, after the model of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople and Kiev, built from the 1030s onwards. And you see here a photograph of a model of the original form of this church in the 11th century, where, of course, also Byzantine artists came to Kiev and also established the basis of what then later became Russian Orthodox art in this period. As I've said, the Varangians in Constantinople now became a permanent part of the Byzantine armed forces in the form of the Varangian Guard. And some regiments of this guard were also employed at the palace as bodyguards of the emperor, and were also part of the imperial ceremonial, which was, of course, very important in the Byzantine context. And we have a description of the famous Byzantine scholar Michael Psellos from the 11th century. And here we read one of these, say, appearances of the Varangians. The Varangians carried shields and a kind of single-edged axe, again the axe as we have heard, on their shoulders. They now hit their shields and roared as loud as they could, then beat up their axes so that the echo of the sound reverberated all around. Then they gathered around the emperor, formed a circle around him as if he was in physical danger, and led him to an upper part of the palace. Of course, the meaning of this ceremonial is not very subtle. It means I have the strongest guys around me, so do not dare to attack me. But one can imagine that this was an impressive show off of the Varangians. The Varangian Guard was also joined by some very prominent members of the Scandinavian elite. The most famous one was Harald Hardrada, later King of Norway, Hardrada meaning the hard one. And he had to flee from Norway due to usurpations, and he first made his way across the Baltic Sea to the realm of the Rus, to Kiev, and then later onwards to Constantinople, where he joined the Varangian Guard and was obviously a successful leader, also made a lot of booty, a lot of gold. And we read this in the later Heimskringla, so a chronicle of the Nordic history by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century. Under Michael's banner, and this is Emperor Michael IV, you, Harald, conquered Serkland. Serkland is the term for land ruled by the Saracens, so Arab-ruled area. In this case, it most probably means Sicily, which at that time was invaded by the Byzantines. So Sicily had also been conquered by the Arabs from the Byzantines in the 9th century, and they tried to reconquer Sicily. This was only partially successful, but Harald was involved in these successful campaigns. So he conquered Serkland, he conquered 10 lands, 10 times in Serkland, I heard that, and he never avoided dangers. He gave away Nathanbet's shine, which means gold in this terminology. Harald the injurer of foreign armies, killed in the grim sword game in Serkland all enemies there on the wide areas. And on the basis of the gold and also the loyalty of warriors he is accumulating, he then returns to Kiev, also is marrying one of the princesses of the Prince of Kiev, and then gets back to Norway, where he eventually in 1047 is able to regain the throne. So he becomes King of Norway, and he's ruling the country for almost 20 years, until then in 1066 he also tries to make his bed for the English throne. He invades England around the same time as William the Conqueror from Normandy, but he is not successful and he dies in a battle in England in 1066. This is the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Then the English troops have to haste back to the south and then encounter defeat in Hastings 1066, which leads to the Norman conquest of England. And this is also then connected with a new wave of warriors coming to Byzantium. because it's now not longer only the Scandinavians, but it's now members of the English elite who flee from England after the Norman conquest, and some of them make their way to Byzantium and get involved, ironically one could say, into the Varangian Guard. So the Varangian Guard is now a term including people from all over of northwestern Europe, including also these English-speaking people, and that they had a significant contribution to the Varangian Guard can also be seen in various artifacts. So we have, for instance, this lead seal from around 1100 that there was this man called Svend who served as a translator of the Englini, so of the English serving in the Byzantine army. And from a later period in the 14th century, where there was still a Varangian Guard following the earlier traditions, we hear that when there was the Christmas celebration in the palace, various troops, representatives of the various regiments, wished Merry Christmas, one could say, and a long life to the Vasilevs. So this is the Byzantine emperor. And here we read in this text from the 14th century, then the Varangi come and wished the Basilevs a long life in the language of their homeland, namely in English, Igon Inglinisti, by clashing their axes against each other. So here we hear that the English language had become a traditional element of the Varangians due to these newcomers in the 11th century. And around that time, the Byzantine army was already before, but especially also in this period, became a very multinational army with people from various regions across Europe and other regions. And we see this, for instance, in this text. This is a charter for the transfer of land to the Athos monastery of Vatopedi. And Emperor Nikolaos III is granting land to this monastery, which at the same time is exempt from the duty to accommodate soldiers of the army of various regiments. And we hear that they are free from the burden of accommodating commanders of the Tagmata and Temata, so these are the usual regiments of the Byzantine army, Roman and mercenary people, and those from auxiliary peoples. And there we have the Ros, so the Rus, the Varangi, the Kulpingi, which mostly relates to another region in Scandinavia, the Kilfingar, the Inglini, so the English, Frangi, the Franks, so from France most probably, Nemitsoi, and the Nemitzi, this comes from the Slavonic term for the German-speaking people, so these are people from Germany, Bulgarians, Saraceni, so Saracens, and then other groups of Romans, so Byzantines, and Athanati. Athanati is also a special corps of the Byzantine army. So all these groups are also here listed, so that no one could say, yeah, but we are not in the text, so we are allowed to use your villages. We also have an interesting description how then various groups of originally Scandinavian descendant met in the Byzantine army. And this is a description from the year 1057, when this already mentioned famous scholar Michael Psellos visited the camp of the General Isa Komnenos, who at that time tried to become emperor. And he describes that Isa Komnenos had in his army both Varangians and Normans from southern Italy. As I have said, in the 11th century, Normans from Normandy came as mercenaries to southern Italy, also fighting for the Byzantines, but also for other princes there, and then eventually a Norman polity emerged. And Normans became also a part of the Byzantine army. And here we have a comparison of these two Scandinavian groups. So Michael Psellos is writing, there stood the Italians, these are the Normans, and the Taurus-Scythians. So again, this is this archaizing term for the Varangians, scary their sight and the Normans in hate. The soldiers of both contingents were blue-eyed, but the Normans painted their faces and plucked their eyebrows, while the Varangians retained their natural appearance. The Normans are light-footed in battle, quick and mobile in action, but the Varangians fight like madmen, as if they were burning with rage. The Normans are so savage that few can resist their first attack, but they quickly get tired. The Varangians are much slower to start, but they do not take care of themselves, they do not pay attention to their wounds, and their physical integrity. So this sounds like a description of berserkers, as we have from other sources. The Varangians stood behind their shields, carrying very long spears and single-edged axes, again the axes always, on their shoulders, as they painted pointed their spears forward, forming a kind of impenetrable barrier. So again, also a very impressive show of the power of this group. We also have some episodes of encounters between the Varangians and the indigenous Byzantine population. And a very interesting episode is reported in the Chronicle of Yanis Skilitzis, and to the right you also have an image illustrating this episode in the famous illustrated manuscript of the Chronicle of Skilitzis, which is now found in Madrid, Skilitzis Madridensis. And here we read, something else remarkable happened in this year. The year is 1034. One of the Varangians stationed for the winter in the Thracian theme, so in the province of Thrace. So this is a region where the troops had to be accommodated during the winter, which were not exempt as the territories of Vatupedi, met a woman from the country in the wilderness and tried to seduce her. Since he did not convince her and therefore began to use force, she pulled the man's sword, rammed it into the barbarian's heart, and killed him on the spot. So a very impressive woman. When the crime became known in the surrounding area, the Varangians gathered, and one could have expected now that they would try to take revenge upon the woman, but they honored the woman and handed over to her all the possessions of the perpetrator, whom they left without burial in accordance with their law. So here we have also something laudable to tell about these barbarians, so that they would respect the integrity of this woman, that this was done also in order to defend herself, and that even she was compensated for this attack with the property of the perpetrator. So a very interesting episode. And another episode where the Varangians are also depicted as law-abiding element of Byzantine society comes from a later time, 1201, so shortly before the conquest in Constantinople of 1204, comes from a text of Nikolaos Mesarites, who was also a higher-ranking official at the Byzantine court. And here it is about an encounter with various troops again in a church in Constantinople. And then the barbarian, here it is an Alamanos, so a member of the German mercenary regiment, wanted to force me to give him my property, and he looked at me with wild, greedy eyes, grabbed my arm and threatened to kill me. Then the Barbari who carried the axe, they show up, these are the Varangians, were more God-fearing, and they noticed what was happening, took righteous anger against the Alamanos and pushed the cursed away. Then a tear stream broke out of my eyes, not from suffering but from joy, because even liberation from a predicament can elicit tears from the people, from people. I recognized many of the Barbari because they were known to me from before. They also came to me and greeted me warmly because we were familiar and kind to each other. So obviously Mesarites had established a good relationship to these Varangians, and they helped him against this other foreign mercenary who had tried to rob him. We also have inscriptional material, so inscriptions of members of the Varangian Guard who left their names in prominent places. One of the most prominent, of course, was Hagia Sophia, so there are these runic inscriptions in the Hagia Sophia. Another one are runic inscriptions of this lion statue, which was originally in the harbor of Athens in Piraeus, and then later was transported to Venice, where you can now find it. So the Varangians had become an important part of the Byzantine armed forces, and also later emperors tried to attract additional warriors from Scandinavia, and this we see here in a Scandinavian source, the Sverris saga, and here we see that the emperor in 1195, this was Alexios III Angelos, and you see him here depicted on coins, sent members of the Varangian Guard, so Scandinavians, to Norway, to Denmark, and to Sweden to attract further recruits for the Varangian Guard. And this was accompanied also by an official Chrysopolos logos, so a privileged charter of the emperor with a golden bull, also to impress these foreign kings, one could say. Yeah, we don't know how successful this action was, but we know that the Varangian Guard was also fighting in 1204, when then Constantinople had to be defended. We also read in other texts how Byzantium was located in the Scandinavian worldview. To the right, you have a reconstruction of a world map in the imagination of the Scandinavians in the 12th century. At that time, they already were Christianized, so they had been exposed to the traditional division of the world in the three continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And they also tried to connect their discoveries in the northern Atlantic with this traditional worldview. And so they assumed that Greenland was connected via a land bridge to Europe, and Vinland was connected to Africa. This would mean that originally also these new territories were connected to the traditional three-continent ordering of the world. And in one world description from the 12th century, you also have this text about the route and then the location of Constantinople. So we read Europe is the third part of the world. It extends from the west and northwest to the northeast. The Gardavelde lies in the eastern part of Europe. There are Holmgard, this is Novgorod, Balteska, Polotsk, and Smolensk. In Könogard, Kiev, so various important centers of the Russian principalities. Following the Gardavelde, the Greek Konugar Empire, so that's the Greek Empire, the Byzantine Empire extends to the south. The head of the Riki of that empire is called Constantinopolis, which is called Miklatgard. In Miklatgard is the church, which is, according to another habit, is called Hagia Sophia, but the northern people call it Agisiv. This church is the most magnificent of all churches in the world in its construction and size. So also confirming this description we have from the Russian Laurentius Chronicle about the visit of the delegates of Prince Vladimir. This church is the most magnificent, yeah. Under the Greek conjugal are Bulgaraland, so Bulgaria, and the archipelago called Kriklanseia, which is the Aegean, with the islands of Crete and Cyprus. Sicily is a large region and belongs to the continent that is also called Europe. So here we have a very detailed, at least knowledge about the various territories, the main islands, and also the political conditions at this time in Byzantium and its neighboring regions. And this knowledge came most probably from members of the Varangian Guard returning to Scandinavia, or also from these delegates about which we have read just before. Now, if you would like to know more about this and really have an immensely vast corpus also of texts in translation, I can recommend this great book of Roland Scheel, Skandinavien und Byzanz, Bedingungen und Konsequenzen mittelalterlicher Kulturbeziehungen, published in 2015 in Göttingen with Vandenhoek and Ruprecht. 2 volumes with more than 1,300 pages, and really an immense, several hundred pages catalog with a collection of all important sources in Greek, in Latin, in Scandinavian languages, with translation and commentary. So really a treasure for all those interested into these aspects. Unfortunately, it's in German, so you have to read German, but it's really, I would guess that's now the basic and essential work on this topic. And I also have made use of Scheel's book also for this talk, for instance, as you can see also in these images. So I won't go into detail into this, like also Byzantium and Byzantine objects became models for art and artistic production in Scandinavia. As you can read a lot about this in Scheel's book, and these are only 2 examples of coinage, also of silk textiles which made it to Scandinavia. The same is true for the impact of Byzantine Christianity. Of course, the Scandinavian territories were Christianized from the Catholic Church, from Hamburg and other bishoprics, but we also have a significant influence of Byzantine Christian art, objects traveling to Scandinavia, and have an influence of this on the artistic production there, also in wall painting. So that's also another very fascinating aspect about it, which you can read more in Scheel's book. We also have this interesting episode indicating that even bishops from Byzantine territories or from Orthodox territories made it all the way to Iceland. And this is from the Icelandic Ragas legal book. So that's a legal text from the 12th century. And it is regulating what happens if a non-Catholic clergyman come to Iceland, especially groups which are called Hermskir, which has been interpreted even as Armenians, and Armenians were very prominent throughout the Byzantine Empire, or Girskir, which means Greeks or maybe Russians. But at that time, in the Russian principalities, also still most of the bishops, or many bishops, were sent from Constantinople. So although they came from Russia originally, maybe they had come even from Constantinople. And obviously some of these people, via the trade connections to the Baltic and the North Sea, made it to Iceland. And here we see what should happen in that case. It is lawful to hear their masses when people want to attend them, but you must not pay for their spiritual activities and accept no services from them. If a man consecrates such a bishop who is not trained in Latin, consecrates a church or gives confirmation to children, he will be fined 3 marks to the bishop who was here before, which is of course the Latin bishop. He should also take the consecration fee. The churches should then be consecrated, and the children should be confirmed as if nothing had been done beforehand. So this is already also during the period where we have the schism between the Latin Church and the Orthodox Church, and the deeds of these Orthodox bishops are declared not valid. Of course, it's also connected to the legislation and to the possibility to get money for these spiritual acts, but it's also on this background about the division of the church, which even is obviously significant for what is happening in the northernmost part of Christian Europe. Another interesting episode of encounter between Scandinavia and Byzantium is the pilgrimages of Scandinavian kings. We have several occasions where kings from Scandinavia travel to the Eastern Mediterranean, of course on the way mostly to Jerusalem, but also making station in Constantinople, and they're also encountering members of the Varangian Guard, some of which were originally men from their own kingdoms in Scandinavia. And one case is King Eric's pilgrimage from King Eric of Denmark, who via Russia traveled to Constantinople and Jerusalem, also visited Constantinople, but then on his way to Jerusalem died in Paphos in Cyprus, where we also have this interesting grave inscription. So also here one Scandinavian king also even dying in Byzantine territories. As I've said, there is then this severe hiatus, and we are now coming towards the end of our talk. In 1204 and 1204, Crusaders and Venetians conquer and pillage Constantinople after getting involved into a civil war, a rivalry over the throne in Constantinople. And in these fights, we also hear about that the Varangian Guard is trying to defend the city, but to no avail. Constantinople is conquered and plundered, and the Byzantine Empire seems to have ended at the time. Although then, more than 50 years later, in 1261, one Byzantine Empire in exile, Nicaea, from their troops are able to reconquer Constantinople from the Latins in 1261, in summer 1261, and the Byzantine Empire is reconstructed, one could say, around Constantinople. But of course, it's now very much reduced in its power. Still, it tries to maintain the earlier traditions, and this also include the Varangian Guard. For the Russian territories, the most severe event in the 13th century is, of course, the Mongol conquest. We have talked about Mongol history and also its relation to Byzantium in earlier talks on this channel. We already have a first Mongol advance to Eastern Europe still in the lifetime of Genghis Khan in the 1220s, and then the final conquest of this territory is also the destruction of Kiev in 1240, and this also ends the traditional framework of principalities there. Still, as we have heard, Byzantium is reconstructed around Constantinople, and we also hear up until the mid-14th century that the Varangian Guard is maintained. We already have read this text that in the mid-14th century, during celebrations, the Varangian Guard is using the traditional English language, and we also hear still about their role in ceremonial. Here also have a reconstruction of members of the Varangian Guard in their military the military uniform and in their uniform for ceremonial contexts. And we hear that, for instance, during the Ipapanti festival, which is in February, there was also an occasion where the emperor was visiting the Blacherne church, which is in the northern part of Constantinople, where there was also the Blacherne Palace, which had become the most important palace at that time. And when the emperor visited this church, he was also accompanied by the Varangians, who are still carrying the axes on their shoulders. So we still have also the axes. And we also have here this depiction, which is from the 1340s. This is Emperor John VI Cantacusinos in midst of a synod, of an assembly of bishops, and behind him, behind his throne, you can see these are members of the Varangian Guard, still also here serving as bodyguards of the emperor. But these are the last documentations which we have. So from the mid-14th century, the Varangian Guard disappears from the sources. That's also in the period when Byzantium finally is turned into a minor polity with very meager resources. So we can also assume maybe that there was not longer the money basis to maintain this guard. And then after, more than almost 400 years, this tradition of the Varangian Guard ends. But there is an afterlife also of the Varangian Guard. And here to the end, I refer to this fascinating article by Antje Bosselmann-Rückby, which was published in 2018 in this volume on Byzantium and the West. And she wrote an article, Heavy Metal Meets Byzantium, and it's about how the Varangian Guard is depicted in heavy metal albums of the Finnish band Turisas. I also have here the link. So there was an entry on medievalists.net. We also have links to YouTube videos of these songs. Or even after this talk, you can directly enter Turisas into your search window of YouTube and then relax to the sounds of heavy metal singing about the deeds of the Varangian Guard. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention. I hope there will be other opportunities where we will meet on this channel, and I hope this was of interest. And if you have further questions, you can of course always write also an email to me. So thank you very much.